Have you ever imagined waking up to see the sun vanish from the sky for over a year? Not because of an eclipse, but something far more sinister. In 536 AD, the world was plunged into darkness. Crops failed. A biting cold gripped regions once fertile, and the sky seemed shrouded by a veil of dust. People believed the end of days had arrived, and for many, it truly had. Historians regard this as the worst year to be alive. But what, in fact, happened in 536? And how did this global collapse shape the centuries that followed, from the fall of empires to the birth of apocalyptic myths? In this video, we will journey to a moment forgotten by time, yet one that may still echo in our lives in ways we cannot imagine. Picture a morning like any other, when you wake and peer through the window. But what you see is indescribable. The sky, usually clear, is now cloaked in a dense gray haze. Sunlight scarcely reaches the earth, turning the day into a perpetual dusk, as if night had settled in for good. And, worse still, the cold begins to creep into your home, seeping through every crack in the walls. This was the scene of what many call the worst year in history, the fateful year 536 AD. To understand what occurred, we must travel back in time and explore the convergence of catastrophic events that afflicted the entire planet. The first sign of global disaster was a massive volcanic eruption. Scientists believe that around mid-536, a great volcano, possibly in Asia, erupted, spewing an immense quantity of ash and particles into the atmosphere. These particles formed a thick layer in the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight from reaching the Earth. What did this cause? A drastic drop in temperatures, resulting in an exceptionally cold summer. Global temperatures plunged, and agriculture was severely impacted. In Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, harvests failed, leading to unprecedented food shortages. The winter of 536 was long and harsh, and it did not end the following year. Indeed, the world endured a decade of chilly summers and severe winters, a period remembered as the Great Famine. The immediate impact of this catastrophe was immense. Food scarcity led to mass starvation, causing a dramatic decline in population. Urban infrastructures collapsed, and desperate people began to migrate in search of resources. Those who did not succumb to hunger or disease were profoundly affected by the psychological trauma of this era of scarcity. But the worst was yet to come. With the collapse of empires, the political structures of the time fell into crisis. The Byzantine Empire, then under Emperor Justinian, was already struggling internally, but now faced barbarian invasions and a terrible plague that spread across the empire, exacerbated by the crop failures. Wars and social collapse spread like wildfire. Moreover, the eruption of 536 was not the only natural calamity to mark this period. After the initial blast, further volcanic explosions occurred in 540 and 547 AD, prolonging the climatic and social chaos. Sun visibility was so reduced that, in Europe, the sky appeared veiled by a kind of golden mist that darkened the landscape. For many, the world seemed to be bidding farewell, with signs of an imminent apocalypse. Fear of the end times spread across cultures and religions, and many legends of the world's destruction sprang from this era. Food shortages were not the only problem. Public health was gravely affected. The onset of the plague of Justinian in 541 AD, which killed millions, was one of the greatest legacies of this time. Transmitted by rat fleas, the disease swept through cities at alarming speed, killing indiscriminately. The Byzantine military forces could not contain it. Further, weakening the empire, the plague was so devastating that, In subsequent centuries, it would be forever associated with this era of chaos, darkness, and despair. What makes 536 AD even more enigmatic is that, while the consequences of this era were clearly catastrophic, for empires and populations alike, no one knew exactly what was happening. There was no scientific explanation for the phenomenon of darkness, and people turned to religion to comprehend the events. Some saw it as divine punishment, while others believed it to be a sign of the world's end. This collective terror and the search for supernatural answers also helped shape the medieval mindset that would flourish in the following centuries. Now, imagine living in that time. You would not possess the knowledge we have today, and the explanations for what was happening would lie beyond your understanding. The fear of a hopeless future would be palpable, and the struggle for survival would become everyone's primary concern. But how, then, did humanity endure this series of natural and social disasters? As the world staggered under the effects of volcanic eruptions and devastating famine, the power structures that had governed for centuries began to crumble. The Byzantine Empire, though still standing, faced an unprecedented internal and external siege. Justinian, one of history's most ambitious emperors, saw his grand reconquest projects of the old Western Roman Empire collapse. War, plague, and resource scarcity drained the empire's finances, leaving it vulnerable. Magnificent Constantinople, jewel of the ancient world, became a stage of despair, with corpses piling in the streets and markets emptied of supplies. But the tragedy of 536 was not confined to the Greco-Roman world. In the far north of Europe, the Scandinavian peoples, heavily reliant on summer agriculture, faced a crisis that led to the reorganization of their beliefs and lifestyles. Archaeology reveals that entire villages in Sweden and Norway were abandoned, and there is evidence of human sacrifices in rituals to appease the gods. Centuries later, Norse sagas would recount these times as the Fimbul Winter, the Great Winter that would precede Ragnarok, the end of the world. What began as a natural cataclysm gave rise to myths that would endure through the ages. In China, the chronicles of the Wei dynasty speak of a mysterious mist that lingered for months, failed harvests and epidemics. Instability led to peasant revolts and internal wars, creating a power vacuum that weakened the empire and paved the way for new dynasties to emerge. Curiously, it was in this atmosphere of ruin that Buddhism expanded forcefully, offering spiritual consolation amid visible chaos. Meanwhile, the Persian world, ruled by the Sassanid Empire, was not spared. Food shortages and diminished military strength contributed to weakened borders and increased tribal conflicts. Nomadic peoples began to move more aggressively, taking advantage of the great power's weakness. It was as though the very fabric of civilization was being torn apart from all sides at once. And we cannot ignore Britain, where darkened skies and failed harvests coincided with what is believed to be the true backdrop for the legend of King Arthur. Without Roman rule, the British Isles were mired in wars between small kingdoms and Saxon invasions. From this chaos emerged tales of a warrior leader who united tribes and resisted invaders, stories that, centuries later, would become the Arthurian myths. Thus, from literal and symbolic darkness arose one of the greatest legends of the Middle Ages. It was not only empires that suffered. The daily lives of ordinary people were profoundly altered. In European villages, peasants buried their seeds in frozen ground, hoping for a miracle. Monks recorded in manuscripts the fear that consumed communities. In many cases, small villages vanished entirely, their stories lost with them. Only ruins remained as clues that life had once thrived there. The collective perception that the E2E world was ending triggered profound cultural changes. The search for meaning amid chaos led many communities to embrace mysticism, prophecies, and celestial omens. Astrology gained renewed importance, and sightings of comets or eclipses were interpreted as dark portents. Monastic accounts from the period describe the sky tinged red at dusk, as if the very heavens were ablaze. It was a terrifying spectacle, yet mesmerizing. It was on this ground of fear, loss, and transformation that the roots of the medieval mindset were sown. The idea that earthly suffering was part of a divine plan took hold, along with the need for penance, purification, and salvation. Christianity grew even stronger in many regions, while other religious traditions adapted or faded away. It was the birth of a new spiritual order, forged in the heart of darkness. As the world slowly emerged from the gloom that began in 536, the scars left by that decade of calamities would shape the course of history like few other eras. The earth had trembled under the weight of darkness, famine, and plague. But the true impact of this period was not only in the visible destruction, it lay in the invisible, in the way entire societies came to perceive time, power, and the sacred. The first great change was the collapse of trust in established systems. Faith in rulers, in the old gods, and even in the natural order was profoundly shaken. This created fertile ground for cultural and religious revolutions. In the West, Christianity seized the opportunity to expand like never before. Missionaries were seen as bearers of hope, not only spiritual, but also practical. Their messages brought order to chaos, promised redemption, and offered a new narrative to explain the tragedy that had befallen the world. The Church, with its growing network of monasteries and centers of learning, assumed the role once held by imperial power. Manuscripts were copied, ancient knowledge preserved and reinterpreted through the lens of Christian faith. It was amid this effort that the foundations of what would later be known as medieval Christendom were laid. The notion that the world had endured a silent divine judgment and that men were called to live in penance and obedience became central. In the East, especially in India and parts of Southeast Asia, climatic instability led to changes in trade routes and the rise of new urban centers that had previously been mere way stations. Kingdoms reorganized based on new economic dynamics, paving the way for the flourishing of cultures that, centuries later, would be instrumental in the emergence of great empires. The ancient world was dying, but something new was beginning, albeit slowly, painfully, and often imperceptibly to those who lived it. Yet not all the effects of 536 were purely destructive. Some see in this climatic collapse the beginning of a profound transformation of human civilization. The years of adversity forced survivors to reinvent their social structures. Peoples who had once been rivals began to cooperate out of sheer necessity. New methods of cultivation and food preservation were tested, trade routes were redirected, and gradually, a new political geography began to take shape. It is curious to note that some of the realms that would arise after this period would become the seeds of modern nations. From the void left by the collapse of ancient powers emerged local leaders with identities more rooted in their territories, less dependent on distant empires and closer to the people. The concept of royalty, once associated with absolute divine right, began to be reconsidered in light of survival and usefulness. Kings who protected and fed their people were revered, while those who failed were forgotten or overthrown. This period also left deep marks on art and literature. In surviving visual representations, we see fear etched in religious icons, monsters symbolizing plague and famine, and saints interceding for the afflicted. Oral narratives gained strength, stories of resilience, of miracles in times of darkness, of communities standing together. All these became fundamental elements in the cultures that inherited the mantle of civilization. But perhaps the most intriguing legacy of 536 AD is how it vanished from collective memory for centuries. The surviving records, fragmented and enigmatic, were only pieced together in the 21st century with the aid of modern science. Studies of tree ring growth, polar ice layers, and volcanological analyses allowed scholars to reconstruct the puzzle of this global cataclysm. And the more they discovered, the clearer it became that 536 was not merely a bad year, it was an epochal turning point. Like a dark whisper lost in the mists of time, that year altered the course of human history forever. It reminds us of our fragility in the face of nature's forces, but also of the resilience that silently pulses through each generation. A reminder that, even in the densest darkness, there are those who kindle a flame, however small, and keep it alive until the sun returns. The year 536 AD was not just an isolated tragedy in time, but a silent landmark that redefined humanity's Swahar's paths. From the mist that obscured the sun for over a year, emerged new myths, strengthened religions, transformed civilizations, and, above all, the certainty that the world could change overnight, and not necessarily for the better. We revisited a time when the sky darkened, the earth ceased to bear fruit, and death lurked like a constant shadow. We saw empires falter, populations migrate, and fear shape beliefs that would echo for centuries. The night of 536 was long. It lasted not just days, but years, and in it were forged the seeds of the Middle Ages, with all its spirituality, decentralized power structures, and profoundly symbolic vision of existence. Today, in the light of science and archaeology, we can unveil the veil that shrouded this dark period. But the questions it raises continue to resonate. How would we react if a similar event occurred now? Are we prepared to face the unpredictable? Can the past teach us to endure, reorganize, and begin anew? When we look back to the worst year in Trawait history, we do not find only despair. We find the spark of human continuity. Amid the darkness, humanity did not perish. It adapted, it persisted, and it survived. Now we want to hear from you. Would you have survived 536? What intrigued you most on this journey? Leave your theories, questions, and discoveries in the comments. And if this story fascinated you, share it with fellow history enthusiasts. After all, the past still lives within us, waiting to be rediscovered. Until our next journey through the shadows of history.